As a white kid growing up in the suburbs, there was a lot I wasn't taught about the city. The short version of what I was taught goes something like this. In 1967, the blacks went crazy and burned down the greatest city in America, and we whites were forced to leave. The adults never said why. Black day in July. I left Michigan as a young man and returned a middle-aged reporter, and that story didn't make sense anymore. So I traced my own people's journey north. We weren't Cajuns like I'd been told. We're Creoles, Louisiana people who'd been born black but lived in Detroit as white. Why? I went to my grandfather's birthplace on the banks of the Mississippi. His cousins still live there. Good morning, how you doing?
Just fine.
Really great to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
Fantastic to meet you.
A lot of so-called mulattoes, or whatever they called us, they moved away. They were really like a class within two classes. One was white, one was black, and here you are, a little of each. This one didn't want you around, that one didn't want you around.
Great-grandpa Henri LeDuff was the illiterate son of a sharecropper. No picture of him exists, but he was said to be light-skinned, born to this man, Donache LeDuff. Henry would take Inez Porcher as his wife. She was from a well-to-do Creole family. When Henri went north to seek his fortune in Detroit's factories, she stayed here, in Baton Rouge, with her two sons, my grandfather Roy and his brother Earl. The census lists them as mulattoes.
Back in the 1920s, folks like Henry LeDuff, who wanted to be a part of the American dream and move on up north, would have come to this place. This was the depot of the Texas and Pacific Railroad and new roads, and those tracks led north.
So this was, his car would have been segregated.
It would have been.
He would have got in the colored car.
Exactly, even though he was as fair as you and I probably. If you had just a portion of black blood, I think it was 1/64th, and you were 63, 64th, you were still considered black. When he got up north, he could register on the census as a white man, and no one knew.
When Henri LeDuff got off the train, he decided to pass for white and call himself Henry. He took a room in a white woman's boarding house on Detroit's east side, telling the census man his mother was from Paris and spoke only French. Henry escaped the segregated Jim Crow South for the North, where every man was supposedly equal.
When he came to Detroit, he would have found a world that in many ways resonated with what he knew about Louisiana. It would have been a world in which blacks were restricted in terms of where they could live and where they could work. The jobs that were available were the ones that employers deemed suitable replacement for the immigrant workforce, the worst jobs, the dirtiest jobs, the most unhealthy jobs.
Between 1910 and 1930, 1 million people moved to Detroit. 120,000 of them were black, and blacks were legally barred in Detroit from living in all but the worst ghettos. Since great-grandpa Henry was now white, it allowed him to buy property and build his house here on Burwood Street. In 1924, he sent for his wife and teenage sons.
White supremacy was so powerful an ideology in Detroit that in 1924, the Ku Klux Klan endorsed candidate actually won a majority of the vote for mayor. He could not take office because it was a write-in campaign, and so many of his supporters had misspelled his name. They were burning crosses on the steps of City Hall. And so it would have been something of a shock, I think, given the expectation that the North was going to be so substantially different.
My great-grandmother, much darker than her husband, rarely ventured out.
There was never any parties at our house. Daddy would go out on his own, visit the bars and his friends. Never took Mother with him. He never had us even introduced any of his friends.
Do you know you're black?
No. They never said anything. They never mentioned anything about their life. When they first got married, they never had a picture taken when they were married. Oh, no, I won't say that. Maybe they did. But the church burned down.
But that church still stands on the banks of the Mississippi. It turns out nothing burned down except the past.
I think they wanted to stay white and have a better living. Someone told me somewhere, sometime, that their children were doctors.
In 1930, my great-grandparents and their 3 children were designated on the census as W. After 2 centuries, we LeDuffs were miraculously scrubbed white. With the end of World War II, the city was now 1.8 million people, 300,000 of them black. Restrictive mortgages still forbade selling or renting to blacks. The federal government even paid for this, a racial Berlin Wall along the same street my great-grandfather built his home, to keep the blacks out. Around that time, my cousin Jerry's family came up from Louisiana. They came as blacks.
It's like living up south instead of down south. It's the same thing. You know, you're faced with the same problems, not to the same degree, but they were still there. The Jim Crow era happened here. There's places all over Detroit, you know, right in the city of Detroit, that black person couldn't live.
Great-grandpa Henry LeDuff passed on in 1951, joining his wife. That same year, his son, my grandfather Roy, met Betsy Steele, a waitress. They danced at the Vanity Ballroom on the east side of the city. She called herself white, which was half true. She was also a Chippewa Indian.
This is where my grandparents met. It couldn't have been a Monday night because that was black night only because they didn't want people mixing. Nobody knew that they were both mixed. They came up with somebody like me.
Grandpa Roy brought 2 children from a previous marriage, including my father. Betsy brought 6 children, including my mother. Together they made 10. A white family with Priscilla curtains and crystal goblets in the house that great-grandpa Henry built. Later in life, my mother and father fell in love and married.
You think Grandpa knew he was black?
Your grandpa or my grandpa?
My grandpa.
Your grandpa. Yes. Yeah, he was old enough when we left Louisiana.
I don't care if he was black, and I could have seen it. I love that man. I'll love that man till I go to my grave. And that's what I see.
As the family was living the white life, trouble was brewing. Blacks began to jump the cinder block wall in search of a better life.
The restrictions placed on what blacks could do in the way of employment, in terms of living and the circumstances of their entire lives, are increasingly oppressive as the black community is expanding dramatically. By the time we get to 1966, 1967, the police force remains overwhelmingly white. And in fact, the police commissioner later testified that his principal job was to persuade the white officers, who represented about 95% of the police force, that they did not have the constitutional right to beat African Americans when they took them into custody.
And on July 23, 1967, white cops began knocking black heads at an after-hours party on Claremont Street.
The Motor City's burning.
Blacks won back, and the city burned for 5 days. It was, at the time, the most devastating riot in the history of America. Detroit has never recovered.
Ain't a thing that I can do.
We call it an insurrection against the powers that were, regardless of the fact where they were turning a lot of their anger and their anxieties on their own community, but that's all they knew.
Most of the people back then still had the old segregationist way of thinking. You know, just nothing had changed up to that point. And the riots forced the issue.
My father was working that hot Sunday evening. My mom and grandparents stood on the lawn of the house on Burwood Street and watched the city burn.
Dad went out and bought a gun. He didn't own a gun. He didn't believe in hunting, or actually went out and bought a gun. And she wanted Dad to sell, and he just said he would hang on. And then I guess they had some heated discussions, and he told her, he said, "How many can there be?" And
he was one of them.
that's true.
We've all been prejudiced, and I probably have been also. And here I was talking about myself.
That's one gift he gave me, his whole family, as they were raised as white people.
And why is that a gift? Why is that a gift?
Well, I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have that.
That's true.
That's very true.
It's hard to be black.
Yeah, it's very hard.